Imagine waking up one morning to find that the most powerful empire the Western world had ever known, an empire that had stood for centuries, that had conquered nations and built roads across continents, was trembling. Not because of a rival empire with equal armies and equal resources, but because of people it had barely heard of a generation before. People who seemed to appear from nowhere, riding out of the eastern horizon like a force of nature. People who had no cities, no written language, no monumental architecture, and yet were dismantling civilization as the ancient world knew it. How does a people with no fixed home conquer half the known world? How does a leader with no formal education, no royal lineage in the traditional sense, and no navy bring two of the greatest empires in history to their knees? And perhaps most haunting of all, how does an empire that burns so brilliantly simply vanish within a single generation of its greatest triumph? This is the story of the Huns, and it is far stranger, far more complex, and far more human than the legend suggests. If you find yourself gripped by stories like this, history told as it actually was, not as a comfortable myth, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It genuinely helps us keep making these videos, and there is a great deal more history waiting for you here. Now, let us go back, way back, to a world on the edge of transformation. To understand the Huns, you first need to understand the world they entered. And to understand that world, you need to shed one of the most persistent myths in all of ancient history. The myth goes like this: Rome was eternal. Rome was invincible. Rome fell because of the barbarians who attacked it from outside. It is a clean story. It is also deeply misleading. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was not a monolith of strength. It had been split, formally divided between Eastern and Western administrations, each with its own emperor, its own court, its own priorities. The Western half was hemorrhaging tax revenue, struggling with political instability, and cycling through emperors at a pace that made coherent long-term strategy nearly impossible. The army, once a professional force of Roman citizens, had become increasingly reliant on Germanic foederati, allied warriors who fought under Roman banners but maintained their own cultural identities, their own loyalties, and their own ambitions. Rome was not a fortress waiting to be breached. It was a structure already under internal stress, waiting for the right external pressure to reveal its fractures. And the Eastern Roman Empire, what we sometimes call Byzantium, though its citizens would simply have called it Rome, was wealthier, more stable, and better fortified. Its capital, Constantinople, sat on a peninsula so strategically positioned that it was essentially unassailable by land forces alone. This distinction matters enormously, as we will see. Now shift your gaze east, far east. Beyond the Danube, beyond the Carpathian Mountains, out onto the vast Pontic steppe, the great grassland corridor that stretches from Central Asia all the way to the edges of Europe. This is the highway of history. For thousands of years, nomadic peoples had moved along this corridor. The Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Alans. The steppe was not empty wilderness. It was a dynamic, interconnected world of pastoralist cultures, trading networks, and fierce political competition. The Huns emerged from somewhere in this world. Exactly where is one of the great debates of ancient and medieval history. Ancient Roman writers connected them vaguely to peoples beyond the Caspian Sea. Some modern historians have proposed links to the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation that had clashed with Han Dynasty China for centuries before fragmenting and sending splinter groups westward. The linguistic evidence is fragmentary, the archaeological record is difficult to interpret, and no written Hunnic language survives. What we can say with confidence is that by the 370s of the Common Era, a powerful nomadic confederation calling themselves, or being called by others, the Huns, was moving westward with extraordinary speed and force. Here is one of those facts that stops you in your tracks when you first encounter it. The Huns were not simply wandering, they were organized. Their military system was built around mounted archery of a sophistication that the settled world had rarely encountered. Hunnic composite bows, made from layers of bone, sinew, and wood, were among the most powerful projectile weapons of the ancient world. A Hunnic rider could loose arrows at a gallop with enough force to penetrate armor, and could do so while riding in any direction, including directly away from the enemy. This technique, sometimes called the Parthian shot in reference to another steppe-influenced culture, made conventional infantry formations extremely difficult to maintain against them. You could not simply hold a line and wait for them to crash into you. They would circle, harass, thin your ranks, and shatter your formation before closing in. And they were fast. Faster than any army the Roman world was accustomed to facing. Their entire lifestyle, moving with their herds, sleeping in portable felt tents called yurts, training on horseback from childhood, was a preparation for mobile warfare. They did not need supply lines in the conventional sense. They traveled with their food, their families, and their weapons. This was not an army that needed to return home for winter. This was a people in motion. When the Huns struck the Alans, another powerful steppe confederation, in the early 370s, the result was swift and decisive. Some Alans were absorbed into the Hunnic Confederation. Others fled westward, and this westward flight set off a chain reaction that would reshape the entire Roman world. The people directly in the path of this movement were the Goths, specifically the Greuthungi and the Thervingi, two large Gothic groups settled north of the Danube. The Greuthungi, under their king Ermanaric, attempted to resist. The sources, which are admittedly Roman and therefore filtered through a particular perspective, suggest that the resistance collapsed with startling speed. Ermanaric reportedly died during or shortly after the Hunnic assault, whether by suicide, as some sources claim, or in battle. Historians disagree. What is clear is that Gothic political structures north of the Danube fractured under Hunnic pressure. The Thervingi, led by a chieftain named Fritigern, made a different calculation. They approached the Danube, the Roman frontier, and asked for permission to cross, to be admitted into Roman territory, to become refugees. This moment in the year 376 is one of the genuine pivot points of Western history. The Emperor Valens, ruling from the Eastern Court, agreed. He saw an opportunity, a large population of Gothic warriors who could be settled on depopulated Roman land and recruited into the Roman army. It seemed like a pragmatic solution to multiple problems at once. What it actually was a catastrophic miscalculation. Not entirely his fault, but catastrophic nonetheless. The Roman officials tasked with managing the Gothic crossing were corrupt and incompetent. Food promised to the Goths was withheld or sold back to them at extortionate prices. Gothic children were reportedly taken as slaves in exchange for dog meat. The humiliation and desperation of a people who had come seeking safety and found exploitation instead boiled over into open revolt. 2 years later, in August of 378, at a place called Adrianople in what is now northwestern Turkey, the Gothic forces under Fritigern met the Roman army under Valens himself. The battle that followed was one of the most consequential in ancient history. The Roman army, perhaps 20,000 soldiers, possibly more, estimates vary, was routed. Valens himself was killed. Whether he died in the fighting or was burned alive in a farmhouse where he had taken shelter, the sources disagree, but the outcome was the same. A Roman emperor was dead on the battlefield, and the army of the Eastern Empire had been shattered. Adrianople did not happen because of the Huns directly, but it happened because of the chain reaction the Huns had triggered. The Goths were at Adrianople because the Huns had pushed them there. The pressure from the east was already reshaping the Roman world before a single Hun had set foot on Roman soil. Now the Huns themselves began to move into the picture more directly. Through the 380s and 390s, Hunnic groups raided deep into Roman territory, into the Balkans, into Anatolia, through the Caucasus into the wealthy provinces of the Near East. The Eastern Roman government, under the capable Emperor Theodosius I, managed to stabilize the situation through a combination of military resistance, diplomacy, and the strategic use of Gothic foederati, essentially turning one group of steppe origin warriors against another. Theodosius died in 395, and with him went much of the political coherence of the late Roman system. It was in this environment, a Rome increasingly divided, increasingly reliant on outsiders, increasingly unable to project the kind of unified power it once had, that the Hunnic Confederation began to consolidate into something that looked less like a raiding force and more like an empire. The Huns were not a single unified people under a single ruler in the early decades of their presence in Europe. They were a confederation, a network of clans and subject peoples held together by military success, by the distribution of plunder and prestige goods, and by the authority of powerful leaders. Different Hunnic kings or chieftains operated in different regions, sometimes in coordination, sometimes not. Roman diplomats learned to play these factions against each other, paying subsidies to some Hunnic leaders in exchange for peace or military service while dealing with raids from others. This changed dramatically with the rise of Attila. He appears in the historical record in the 430s, initially ruling jointly with his brother Bleda. The joint rulership was a traditional arrangement in Hunnic political culture, distributing power between senior male relatives. It was also, as history would show, an unstable arrangement. Attila, whose name may derive from a Gothic or Turkic word meaning something like little father or father of the fatherland, though etymologists debate this, was by all accounts a figure of extraordinary political intelligence. The Roman diplomat and historian Priscus of Panium actually met Attila in person, traveling to his court on a diplomatic mission around 449. What Priscus recorded is remarkable, and it is one of our most valuable primary sources for the Hunnic world. Priscus described a court that was far more sophisticated than the Roman stereotype of savage nomads would suggest. Attila's compound included large wooden halls, not Roman in style, but substantial and deliberately impressive. There were feasts with elaborate protocols, toasts in a specific order, gifts exchanged according to careful hierarchies. There were Roman-born secretaries and administrators working within the Hunnic court, writing letters in Latin and Greek on Attila's behalf. There were Gothic nobles who had submitted to Hunnic authority and now served as subordinate kings. There were ambassadors from multiple nations waiting their turn for an audience. And Attila himself? Priscus described him as short, broad-chested, with a large head and small eyes, a man whose physical presence was less imposing than his reputation, but whose manner of authority was unmistakable. He ate from a wooden plate, while his guests ate from silver. He wore plain clothing while his subordinates displayed their wealth. This was not poverty. This was a deliberate political statement, the demonstration that he was above the need for display, that his power required no ornamentation. In 445, Bleda died. The sources are terse on the details, and the most common interpretation among historians is that Attila had him killed, though this cannot be stated as established fact. What is established is that after Bleda's death, Attila ruled alone, and the Hunnic Confederation moved into its most aggressive phase. Here is where the story becomes extraordinary. Attila launched two massive campaigns against the Eastern Roman Empire, the Balkans campaigns of 441 to 443 and 447. The scale of destruction was staggering. Roman cities that had stood for centuries were sacked. The Hunnic forces reached within a day's march of Constantinople itself. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II, ruling from behind the greatest walls in the ancient world, could not be dislodged from his capital, but he could be humbled. The tribute payments extracted by Attila from the Eastern Empire were enormous. At one point, the annual payment reached around £2,100 of gold per year, with additional lump sum payments demanded for past arrears. The Eastern Roman treasury was under severe strain. This is one of those facts that reframes everything. The wealthiest, most administratively sophisticated empire in the Western world was paying protection money to a man who had no cities, no navy, and no written language of his own. The reversal of the expected power dynamic is almost vertiginous. But Attila did not press his advantage to the point of attempting to take Constantinople. Historians have debated why. The walls of the Theodosian circuit, the great triple-layered fortification system that protected the city, were genuinely formidable, and nomadic armies had no tradition of siege warfare sophisticated enough to breach them. It is also possible that Attila calculated, correctly, that a wealthy Eastern Empire paying tribute was more valuable than a destroyed one. He needed the gold. His confederation ran on it. The distribution of wealth from Roman payments was a crucial tool of political cohesion. It kept subordinate chieftains loyal. It funded the gifts and feasts that maintained Hunnic social hierarchies. This points to a structural reality of nomadic empires that is often overlooked. They were not simply engines of destruction. They were sophisticated extractive systems. The Hunnic Confederation needed the Roman world to function, needed its gold, its trade goods, its skilled craftsmen, even its administrators. The relationship was parasitic in some ways, but it was a relationship, not simply a campaign of annihilation. By the late 4040s, Attila had secured his eastern flank, or at least neutralized it, and turned his attention west. The Western Roman Empire was, if anything, in even worse shape than the East. The court at Ravenna was dominated by a powerful general of partly Visigothic ancestry named Aetius, a man who had, fascinatingly, spent time as a hostage among the Huns in his youth and understood their culture and military methods better than almost any Roman alive. Aetius had used Hunnic mercenary forces to maintain his own political dominance within the Western court, playing Roman factions against each other with Hunnic military muscle as his trump card. The relationship between Aetius and Attila had been, for years, one of pragmatic coexistence. Now it was about to become something else entirely. The precise cause of Attila's Western campaign of 451 is one of the more colourful episodes in late Roman history, and it involves a woman named Honoria. Justa Grata Honoria was the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III. She had been caught in a scandalous affair with her estate manager and had been forcibly betrothed to a safe, politically neutral Roman senator as punishment. In desperation or defiance, depending on your reading, she reportedly sent a message to Attila, along with a ring. The interpretation of this message became a diplomatic crisis. Attila chose to interpret it as a marriage proposal and claimed Honoria, and with her, half the Western Roman Empire, as a dowry, as his right. Whether Honoria genuinely intended to invite Attila's intervention or was simply seeking any avenue of escape from her situation, we cannot know. What we know is that Attila used the claim as a pretext, and in the spring of 451, a Hunnic force of extraordinary size, the exact numbers are debated, with ancient sources giving wildly inflated figures, but modern estimates suggest a force of perhaps 100,000 warriors or more, including many Germanic allies, crossed the Rhine and poured into Gaul. The campaign swept through northeastern Gaul with devastating speed. The city of Metz fell. Reims was attacked. Attila's forces moved toward Orleans, a strategically critical city on the Loire River. And here, something unexpected happened. Aetius moved. The Roman general, working with breathtaking diplomatic speed, assembled a coalition that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. Visigoths, the descendants of the very Goths who had crossed the Danube fleeing the Huns, allied with Rome against their old tormentors. Burgundians, Franks, Alans, Saxons, a patchwork of peoples who had every reason to distrust each other, and Rome united by the shared threat of Hunnic domination. The two forces met in late June of 451 at a location the sources call the Catalonian Plains, probably somewhere in the Champagne region of what is now northeastern France. The exact site remains disputed by archaeologists and historians, which is itself a reminder of how much of this history we are reconstructing from incomplete evidence. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, sometimes called the Battle of Chalons, was by any measure one of the largest and most consequential battles of the ancient world. Ancient sources describe it in apocalyptic terms, with rivers running with blood and the dead numbering in the hundreds of thousands. These figures are certainly exaggerated, as ancient battle casualty numbers almost always are. But the scale was clearly immense, and the outcome was genuinely decisive. The Visigothic king, Theodoric I, was killed in the fighting, one of the most powerful rulers in the Western world, dead on the field, but the Hunnic assault was halted. Attila withdrew, establishing a defensive perimeter of wagons, and the battle ended without a clear annihilation of either side. Aetius, in a decision historians have debated ever since, chose not to press the attack and destroy Attila's force entirely. Some historians suggest he feared that a complete Roman victory would make the Visigoths too powerful and undermine his own political position. Others suggest the Roman coalition was simply too exhausted and fragile to sustain a final assault. Whatever the reason, Attila retreated. He was not destroyed, and the following year, 452, he invaded Italy. The Italian campaign was devastating. Aquileia, one of the most important cities in northern Italy, a major commercial hub, was razed so thoroughly that it essentially ceased to exist as a major urban center. Padua, Verona, Brescia, Milan were attacked. The court at Ravenna was in panic. Valentinian III reportedly fled. And then at the Po River, something extraordinary happened. Attila stopped. A delegation came to meet him. It was led by Pope Leo I, Leo the Great, as history would call him. What was said in that meeting, we do not know. The sources are frustratingly vague. Pope Leo's own account naturally attributes the withdrawal to divine intervention, to the appearance of Saints Peter and Paul in a vision that terrified Attila. This is the legend. The historical reality is almost certainly more prosaic. Attila's army was suffering from disease and supply shortages. The Italian campaign had been logistically brutal. There were reports of an Eastern Roman force moving against the Hunnic homeland from the east, threatening to destabilize the Confederation's base, and the gold, the promise of a renewed tribute arrangement, was likely part of the negotiation. Leo was a skilled diplomat as well as a religious leader, and the combination of practical pressures on Attila's position and the offer of a face-saving financial arrangement almost certainly played a larger role in the withdrawal than divine apparitions. But here is the thing about that meeting. It lodged itself in the imagination of the medieval world. The image of the Pope standing between civilization and the destroyer became one of the foundational stories of papal authority. Leo's reputation as a defender of Rome, earned in that moment on the banks of the Po, shaped the political theology of the papacy for centuries afterward. History is full of moments where the legend that grows from an event matters more than the event itself. Attila returned to his court beyond the Danube. He was already planning another campaign, reportedly a renewed assault on the Eastern Empire. He had recently taken another wife, a woman named Ildiko, in what the sources describe as a large celebratory feast. The morning after the wedding feast, Attila did not emerge from his tent. When his attendants finally forced their way in, they found him dead. Ildiko was weeping beside him. There was blood, but it had come from his nose. The most likely explanation, accepted by most modern historians, is that Attila had died from a severe nosebleed, possibly caused by heavy drinking, combined with a condition like esophageal varices, and had drowned in his own blood while unconscious. He was not assassinated. He was not struck down by divine judgment. He died, as many powerful men do, unexpectedly, in bed, in the middle of his plans. The year was 453. And with his death, the Hunnic Empire began to dissolve with a speed that is almost as astonishing as its rise. The structural weakness of nomadic empires built around personal authority became immediately apparent. Attila had sons, several of them, and they immediately began competing for dominance. The Hunnic Confederation had been held together by Attila's personal authority, his ability to distribute wealth and victories, and the fear he inspired in both subordinates and enemies. Without him, the centrifugal forces that personal authority had suppressed came roaring back. The Germanic peoples who had been subordinated to Hunnic power, Gepids, Ostrogoths and others, rose in revolt. In 454, at the Battle of the Nedau River, a coalition of Germanic peoples defeated the Huns decisively. The location of the Nedau is itself unknown, another reminder of how fragmentary our sources are, but the outcome is clear. Hunnic political dominance in Europe was broken. Within a generation, the Huns had fragmented into smaller groups. Some settled in Roman territory as foederati, the very role that Gothic peoples had played before them. Some moved east, back toward the steppe. Some were absorbed into other confederations. The name Hunnic appears in the sources for another century or so, attached to various groups in the Pontic steppe region, but the unified political entity that had shaken the Roman world was gone. The speed of this collapse is one of the most important lessons the Hunnic story has to offer. Empires built on personal charisma and the continuous distribution of military plunder are inherently fragile. They require constant success. They cannot absorb defeat the way institutionalized states can, because the institution is the person. When the person dies, the institution dies with them. Rome, for all its dysfunction, had survived the deaths of emperors, the losses of battles, even the sack of the city itself in 410, when Visigoths under Alaric had walked through the gates of the Eternal City for the first time in 800 years. Rome had institutions, law, administration, the church, the idea of Roman identity itself, that outlasted any individual. The Hunnic Confederation had Attila, and when Attila was gone, so, in any meaningful political sense, were the Huns. But to say the Huns simply disappeared and left no mark would be profoundly wrong. The consequences of the Hunnic century reverberated through European history for generations, in ways both direct and indirect. Most immediately, the Hunnic pressure on the Gothic peoples had set in motion the chain of events that led to Adrianople, to the Gothic settlement within the empire, to the sack of Rome in 410, and ultimately to the establishment of Gothic kingdoms on former Roman territory in Gaul, Spain, and Italy. The Western Roman Empire, which formally ended in 476 when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was not destroyed by the Huns directly. But the cascade of migrations and military crises that the Hunnic expansion triggered created the conditions in which the Western Empire could not survive. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, survived, and in many ways the Hunnic century accelerated its divergence from the West. The enormous tribute payments extracted by Attila had strained the Eastern treasury, but had also forced the Eastern court to develop more sophisticated financial and administrative systems to manage the burden. Constantinople's walls, which had held against Attila, continued to hold against subsequent threats. The Eastern Empire would last another 1,000 years, until 1453, and the parallels between that date and the year of Attila's death are purely coincidental, but history occasionally has a dark sense of irony. The Hunnic invasions also accelerated the Christianization of Western Europe in a paradoxical way. As Roman civil administration collapsed in the West, the Church, with its network of bishops, its literate clergy, its institutional continuity, became the primary organizing force in many communities. The story of Pope Leo meeting Attila at the Po was not just a legend. It was a demonstration of the Church's capacity to act where the Roman state could not. That demonstration had long-lasting consequences for the relationship between ecclesiastical and secular authority in medieval Europe. And then there is the cultural memory, the legend of Attila himself, which took on a life entirely its own. In Germanic tradition, Attila became a figure of almost mythological stature. In the Norse sagas and the Nibelungenlied, the great medieval German epic, a character named Atli or Etzel, clearly derived from Attila, appears as a powerful, sometimes tragic king. The details are transformed beyond recognition, but the shadow of the historical figure is unmistakable. Attila had entered the imaginative life of the cultures he had devastated, transformed into something between a monster and a hero. In Hungary, a different tradition emerged. Medieval Hungarian chronicles, written centuries after the events, claimed that the Hungarians, the Magyars who arrived in the Carpathian Basin in the late 9th century, were the descendants of the Huns, and that Attila was therefore their ancestor and their rightful king. This claim was politically useful for the Hungarian ruling dynasty and became deeply embedded in Hungarian national identity. Modern genetic and linguistic evidence does not support a direct descent of Hungarians from the Huns. The Magyars were a distinct Finno-Ugric people from the Ural region, but the legend proved more powerful than the archaeology. The city of Budapest sits on the Danube, not far from where Attila's court once stood, and the name Attila remains a common given name in Hungary to this day. In the Roman and later Western European tradition, Attila became the scourge of God, flagellum Dei, a term that appears in sources from the period and that encapsulates the theological interpretation of the Hunnic invasions as divine punishment for Roman sins. This framing was deeply influential. It shaped how medieval Christians thought about catastrophe, about the relationship between moral failure and historical disaster, about the meaning of suffering at the hands of outsiders. The Huns were not just a historical event, they were a theological category. There is also a more subtle but profound legacy in the realm of military history. The Hunnic campaigns demonstrated, definitively and repeatedly, the limitations of infantry-based armies against highly mobile cavalry forces. The Roman military response, increasing reliance on cavalry, on mobile tactics, on foederati, who could match steppe warriors in their own style of fighting, accelerated a transformation of Western military culture that would continue through the medieval period. The knight on horseback, the central military figure of medieval Europe, is in some sense a distant descendant of the tactical revolution the Huns forced upon their enemies, and perhaps the deepest legacy of all is geographical. The Hunnic pressure on the Gothic peoples, the chain of migrations it set in motion, the collapse of Roman administration in the West, and the establishment of Germanic successor kingdoms, all of this contributed to the political geography of Europe as it emerged in the early medieval period. The borders, the ethnic distributions, the cultural zones of medieval and early modern Europe were shaped in part by the movements of peoples that the Huns had set in motion. When we look at a map of Europe today, France, Spain, Italy, the Germanic lands, we are looking at a landscape whose contours were partly drawn by the pressure of a nomadic confederation from the eastern steppe in the 4th and 5th centuries. History does not move in straight lines, it moves in cascades. One pressure creates a displacement, which creates another pressure, which creates another displacement, rippling outward through time and space, in ways that no one at the origin point could have predicted or intended. The Huns did not set out to create medieval Europe. They set out to raid, to extract tribute, to expand their confederation's power and wealth. The world they helped unmake was replaced by something they never imagined and would not have recognized. That is the nature of historical transformation. It is rarely the result of a plan. It is almost always the result of collisions between peoples, between systems, between the ambitions of individuals and the structural forces that constrain and redirect those ambitions. Attila died in his tent, choking on his own blood, the night after his wedding. His empire outlasted him by less than 2 years in any meaningful form. A man who had made emperors pay tribute, who had marched from the Rhine to the walls of Constantinople, who had given his name to the nightmares of an entire civilization, gone, just like that. And yet the world he had shaken never quite settled back into its old shape. That is the paradox at the heart of the Hunnic story. A people who built nothing permanent, no cities, no monuments, no written literature, left marks on history that have lasted 16 centuries, not because of what they built, but because of what they moved, what they displaced, what they forced to transform. The Huns remind us that history is not only made by those who build, it is also made by those who disrupt, by the forces that arrive from outside the frame of the expected and demand that the existing order adapt or collapse. Sometimes those forces are armies. Sometimes they are ideas. Sometimes they are diseases or climates. But the mechanism is the same. The disruption reveals which structures were genuinely strong and which were only appearing to be. Rome in the West appeared strong. It had the roads, the law, the legions, the tradition. But the tradition had become a performance. The legions had become mercenaries. The law had become a tool of the powerful rather than a protection for the many. When the Hunnic pressure came, the performance could not hold. What survived in the East, the walls, the administration, the institutional church, survived because it was genuinely robust, not merely impressive. And the Huns themselves, they were genuinely formidable, genuinely innovative in their military methods, genuinely sophisticated in their political arrangements, genuinely capable of adapting the resources of the settled world to their own purposes. But they had built their power on a foundation that required constant motion, constant victory, constant personal authority at the top. When the motion stopped, when Attila died and the victories ceased, and the personal authority fragmented among squabbling sons, there was nothing underneath to hold the structure up. Every empire, every system of power, eventually faces the question of what it is made of beneath the surface. The Huns faced that question in 453, and the answer was, not enough. That question, what is this made of, really, underneath the performance of strength, is one that history asks of every civilization, in every era. It is being asked, in one form or another, right now. That is why this story matters. Not as a curiosity about distant peoples in a distant time, but as a mirror. A demonstration of the mechanisms by which power rises, consolidates, overreaches, and dissolves. A reminder that the most dramatic transformations in history are rarely the result of simple causes or simple villains. They are the result of systems under stress, meeting forces they were not designed to handle, revealing their hidden weaknesses in the most consequential possible way. The Huns were not the destroyers of Rome. They were the pressure that revealed Rome's self-destruction. And that distinction between the cause and the catalyst, between the force that breaks a thing and the weakness that made it breakable, is perhaps the most important lesson history has to offer. What do you think? Was the fall of the Western Roman Empire inevitable, or did the Hunnic invasion simply accelerate a collapse that might otherwise have been avoided or even reversed? Was Attila a visionary leader who built something genuinely remarkable, or was his empire always going to be a single generation's achievement? Write your answer in the comments. This is exactly the kind of debate that makes history worth studying. If this kind of deep, honest, myth-free history is what you are looking for, subscribe to the channel. Every video is built the same way. Real research, real complexity, no easy answers. And if you want to stay in this world a little longer, the next video explores another empire that rose from the edges of the known world and reshaped everything it touched. One whose story connects directly to the world the Huns helped unmake. You will not want to miss it.